For this New Year's Day 2020 episode of the Morning Glory Project, we bring you a reprise of our second episode, which featured the delightful and inspiring Karen Lynch. I know that you'll enjoy this episode. I enjoyed talking with Karen. On this New Year's Day, I wish you all joy and peace. And given that it's the first day not only of a new year, but of a new decade, and a new decade that starts with 2020, clear vision. I rather like that metaphorically. And I hope that this year brings us peace, brings us calm, brings us comfort, and brings us together. Happy New Year from the Morning Glory Project. Welcome to the Morning Glory Project, Stories of Determination. I'm your host, Betsy Graziani-Fossbender. Like in nature, we see determined flowers and vines clinging to life and seeking light. So are Morning Glory people. And in this podcast, I'll interview writers, activists, artists, entrepreneurs, survivors and thrivers, and trailblazers of all kinds. These are folks that have been determined to get over, under, around, and through the obstacles that face them, or to seize the opportunities that come before them. I find these people inspiring and amazing. I know you will too. Today, I'm happy to welcome to the Morning Glory Project, Karen Lynch. Karen is a person who is a Morning Glory, a determined vine, if you will, in many, many ways, not just one. Of course, she's an author. She's written a book called Good Cop, Bad Daughter, which is the chronicle of her own experience being among the first female police officers in San Francisco, where she served for 29 years. But how she even got to that position is a story of determination as well, coming from a very troubled family and from a mom who suffered with mental illness. Overcoming that and kind of finding her own way is part of Karen's story. In addition to that, Karen is also a breast cancer survivor, so I'm pleased to be bringing this to you at the end of National Breast Cancer Month as a story of determination in that way. And Karen has also forged new paths in terms of politics as well. She's an activist and an advocate, always there to help protect an underdog, root for the folks that are troubled, and also having progressive politics when she comes from a police tradition of probably more conservative. So she has endured the differences, and as we all must, in terms of taking our stand for what we believe is right, even if it's different from our family or our community or our profession. So she's a Morning Glory in lots of ways. I'm really inspired by Karen a lot in different areas of life, and I am hopeful that you will be too after hearing her story. Karen, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you making the time.
Thank you so much for having me, Betsy.
Well, let's start with the beginning, which was you call yourself an unlikely police officer. Tell us what made you so unlikely.
I came from a family that they were pretty counterculture, in the sense that my parents both came to San Francisco to be beatniks, and I eventually ended up with a stepfather who had a head shop, and so he and my mother ran a head shop that had a few different locations in San Francisco, but pretty much the hippie tribe of young people who worked there raised me, and my parents were a little bit older than the kids who worked in the store, but they were still pretty counterculture. So I really wasn't the type. I grew up around people who did not really like police.
Who broke the law rather than enforced it more often, right?
Well, I wouldn't say that. They were pretty moral, but I wouldn't say they were anti-morality or anything like that, or amoral. They were very active in protests of the Vietnam War and things like that. So I would say more they were in the activist kind of realm than in the criminal realm, for sure.
So this was what year that you entered the academy?
I went into the academy in 1981, and women had been in for a few years at that point, mid
But not many.
70s. Not many, and we represented probably at that point maybe 9% of the department. So we were still very new, and as oddly enough, the numbers have not increased all that much nationally. There are a few more women cops nowadays, but it still remains really mostly a male-oriented profession.
And I know you were a cop for 29 years. What were those beginning? What were the? I don't want to say just the difficulties, because I know that there were triumphs as well. But what were the challenges and triumphs of that beginning, of being one of a few women in a largely male environment, and not just a male environment? There are lots of male environments, but this is sort of a uber male environment in lots of ways.
Yeah. Well, I think in many ways, my crazy upbringing really, really helped me with a lot of the stuff we had to deal with in the academy. Although the older guys who had been in the department for years were not thrilled that women were coming, and they had fought to keep us out. The men of my generation, for the most part, were pretty open to it. There were exceptions, of course, but for the most part, they knew that this was how it was going to be. But there were, of course, there were many incidents of harassment and crazy stuff. And in those days, there was no Me Too. Pretty much we wanted to get our foot in the door. So the only way we were going to do that was to get along to go along, however that expression goes.
So you just sort of had to suck it up and...
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, the attitude was, if you don't like this, leave. Nobody's stopping you. There's the door. And there was really no... there had been sexual harassment cases and things like that, but for the most part, it was assumed if you were going to want to play with the boys, you were going to have to accept the game by their rules. That was kind of the feeling.
In your book, I'm often touched by how you don't gloss over those moments, but somehow you're not sunk by them.
Yeah, I think part of it was that having grown up with a mother who was, I guess, for lack of another word, abusive in many ways, verbally, emotionally, physically, I had learned to be abused and function anyway. There was always this core part of myself, a resilient part that said, screw you, you're not going to squish my spirit, I'm going to win. And that chip on my shoulder, that sort of survival kind of instinct carried with me into police work. And it was really a good thing. And I had that, and I also had some wonderful classmates, some men in my class who were just incredibly supportive. And so they took my side at times when I felt I was being judged unfairly. And then, there was one particular instance where when they couldn't find any other reason to try to get rid of the women, they would use this thing called the baton dance, which was this 14-step martial art type of thing we had to do with the baton, which really had no relation whatsoever to police work, but was something that our physical training officer, who was a martial arts guy, really liked to have us do. And it was something that was judged subjectively. So if they said, oh, you stepped out of line, oh, you missed this step, you couldn't really fight it. But so that was what they used. And so I would do this. They kept failing me. I was the last woman standing in my class. We started with 4 women out of 45, and they got rid of the other 3. And I was the last one. And it was like down to the last 2 weeks of the 19-week academy. And they kept calling me in to do this test over and over and failing me. And I would do the test. I would do all the steps in front of my classmates, and they would watch me and say, I don't see what they're saying. You look like you're doing it perfectly to me. And they would support me. And the last time I took the test, I remember they were all kind of there watching, and they passed me. And I'm sure that part of it was that I had witnesses present. I don't know, but yeah.
So sounds like it was a combination of your own dogged determination and sort of defiance. It's sort of for lack of a better term, sort of a bird flipping, like,
yeah,
here you guys, I'm not going to let you do this. So there was a combination of that, but also having male advocates that were also looking out for you.
Absolutely. I think if you alienate your coworkers, you're not going to survive in that line of work. And so there's definitely, it's a very complex culture in some regards, but there are rules to it. But if you are a team player, so to speak, and other people in your unit know they can count on you to have their back and help them, they will be there for you too.
So it's no accident that you came with this, but you also didn't come either to or through police work without the challenges that come from growing up the way that you did. I remember hearing a story that you read some years ago that appeared in the book Shades of Blue, published by Amy Ferris, where the first line of that story was that your mom, when you were 7 years old, taught you what?
Oh, how to commit suicide.
Tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, my mother was a very interesting woman. She was bipolar, possibly schizophrenic, although I'm not sure about that diagnosis. And she would just say very bizarre things to me from the time I was a small child. She would read to me from books about Nazi Germany when I was 4 or 5. And that was during the time, I think, not shortly after the Nuremberg trials and all that. So there were lots of books out about the concentration camps and things like that. So she would just tell me these horrible things. And also tell me that she, in her brief time in nursing school before she ended up in a mental hospital, she had learned how to perform a tracheotomy. So on occasion, when we would be out to dinner or something like that, she would let me know that in the event that I should start to choke, she could save me by poking me with a butter knife and performing a tracheotomy, which, gave me a lifelong fear of choking.
Well, yeah, what a thing to say to a little kid.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. So that story in Shades of Blue was, she basically told me how someone would kill themselves with a gun and how you had to make sure that you took out the executive part of the brain and things like that. So growing up when you couldn't trust your mom's yardstick by measuring what was appropriate, it fascinated me in reading both of that story and then your book that you became a cop whose measure is the law, whose measure is doing the right thing. And yeah,
it's such an interesting leap that, like you say in the title, you're an unlikely cop. So it really struck me as how that was very different for you.
Yeah, I could see how in many ways people would think it's unlikely, and it is unlikely, and that's why I chose the title. But at the same time, the police for me represented security. Institutions were always way more secure for me than being home with my mother. So I always felt so safe in school, which I think when Columbine happened, that was one of the most devastating things in my psyche, was thinking, oh my God, all those kids who grew up like I did, who go to school and that's their safe space, now they don't even have that. And so for me, having those institutions around made me feel safe. And when the police came, they were generally trying to save me from her, from my mother. So I did have some negative experiences with cops, but they were pretty minimal compared to the great experiences I had with them. So for me, police were somebody who came to help kids, to help families when things got tough, and I saw myself as someone who was going to help people.
And that's the kind of cop you strive to become.
Yeah, I really did. And regardless of what we hear in the news, the vast majority of police have the intention of helping and being good people and helping their communities. And, unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of stuff that doesn't support that.
Well, like any profession, right? There are those that, I hate this expression, but sort of spoil it for the rest in terms of image. They do and say things that tarnish the good intentions, the invisible good intentions of so many with their conspicuous bad actions.
Absolutely. And there's some people who just should not be cops, who just are, we're just seeing so many. I understand people, many cops who've been in the business for many, many years suffer from PTSD. They have their own things. And it's understandable in the circumstance where someone might jump the gun, so to speak, if they've been a cop for many years and maybe have just trauma upon trauma laid upon them. But we're seeing young cops coming in and, shooting before it's reasonable to shoot sometimes, and sometimes shooting for no reason at all, except they freak out. And I'm not sure exactly what's going on, but it's beyond just now we're seeing it on people's cell phones. It's beyond that. There's something else going on, and I'm not sure why we're getting so many young people who are so anxious with their guns.
It must be heartbreaking for you to see those stories.
It's really heartbreaking because, I also it's unfair because we're so focused on these stories, and there's so much more going on in the criminal justice system that needs our attention.
And of course, it's tragic for the people that suffer the results.
Totally, 100%. I think it's horrible. And I feel just the same as any other citizen when I see what's happening. And, and just the other day talking to a mutual friend of ours who is a person of color, and she feels nervous when the police look at her. And I've heard that from many of my Black friends. I think we have to respect that our fellow Americans, many of them, are having a different experience from the white people in this country. And it's not a good experience for the most part. And we have to start listening and figuring out how we can work together and solve some of the problems, But we also have to be realistic that there are massive numbers of people killing each other with guns, and the police are the ones who respond.
Followers of you on Facebook or other social media would find you an interesting crazy quilt, Karen, of qualities, because most people, I think, would typically associate more cops than not with conservative political views, and yet yours are liberal. And then some people would assume that folks with more progressive or liberal politics might be anti-cop. And you sort of find that middle ground of being for the good cops, acknowledging the ones that aren't behaving so well, and embracing still progressive politics. So I'm wondering how I know you've gotten some, criticism, for lack of a better word, from both sides of the political spectrum. What's that like for you to sit in that lily pad in the middle of that big political pond of scum?
Yeah, it's at times it's a little alienating for me, because I realized that during the 30 years or 29 years I was in the police department, I pretty much kept my personal politics to myself. I didn't really discuss politics. I was never super political, but I was always liberal. I was always a Democrat. I always voted, and I always voted democratically for the most part. I can't think of a Republican I voted for, but I probably was closer to the middle left or the middle of the road than I was to the far left. And then after the election in 2016, I kind of lost my mind a bit. I just felt like everything that we had worked for all of these decades in terms of progress for women and everybody was just being thrown out the window, and I didn't recognize my country anymore. I couldn't believe that my fellow citizens had supported this man who I found so despicable. And so that brought me out of my lethargy about politics, and it made me put on a pink hat and go to Washington, D.C. and and all of that other stuff, and become reasonably active. I mean, I haven't been like a super activist or anything, but I've definitely been out there for every single big thing. And so that did alienate me from some of the cops. And I would have to say San Francisco Police Department, for the most part, is more liberal than many cities. But we do have many people who feel within the police department that the Democrats are anti-cop, and so they vote just for the one issue. They believe that the Republicans support police, which I don't believe is true. And in many ways, like in terms of working benefits and so forth, it's always been the Democrats who've supported us that way. So anyway, so I did lose many friends who just didn't, we just couldn't talk anymore. I mean, obviously not super close friends, although there were a couple I had been very close to, coworkers I had considered friends, who kind of wrote me off because I had become this crazy liberal in their minds.
And you hadn't really become it. You just sort of discovered it.
Yes. Yes. So, and then, and by the same token, I had some friends in the writers community and friends on Facebook who couldn't stand it if I ever defended anything about the police, and called me a fascist and a racist, and then, just decided they couldn't tolerate having me as a friend. And so I got it from both sides, and it was fine. The people who love me no matter what I do or say, and, as long as it's not horrible, but, it's, you're not going to make everybody happy.
Well, I'd like to linger there for a minute, because I think that not only in our political times, but just generally in life, we're going to get criticism from one faction or another. And I'm intrigued by you, Karen, as I've watched you remain both pro-police, pro-good police, and still politically liberal. I've watched how you've weathered those slings and arrows. I've sort of watched how somehow you're able to get to that place of, hey, people are going to say what they're going to say. You're never going to make everybody happy. But I'm wondering how you got there. Like, how do you, is this a belief system that you've adopted? How do you get yourself out of feeling the losses, feeling the criticism in the police department when you were a rookie, feeling upset about having a mom who was so broken and troubled? How do you get to that spot of, hey, it is what it is, and I have to just go on?
That's a good question. I think it's complicated, but I would say from the time I was a small child, I've always had the sense that something bigger was guiding me, like, I guess, a spiritual sense or something. And I always felt like if I just kept doing the next right thing, I would be somehow guided, protected, whatever. And for the most part, I think that has been true. I have felt like I don't understand the reasons why we're here. I don't understand the reasons for all of this, but I do believe there is some reason for it. And just believing that, is helpful to me, I think.
So it's what they would in 12-step rooms call your higher power, perhaps.
Yeah.
That there's something bigger than you that's,
yes,
you're not naming it, and I wouldn't dare to name it for you, but that there's some other bigger reality than just the current thing you're facing.
Yeah. And I kind of believe in the Zen thing, the high involvement, low attachment thing. I like being super involved in the world around me, but ultimately I release it. I release it to the universe for the greater good, and and so I think I have always asked the spirit world, and you can call it whatever you wish. I don't think there's one name for it. I believe in one God. And for me, I ask for support, and I ask to serve, and I ask to, and I'm not saying that prayer is, is like it's not like you're praying to Santa Claus and you get all your wishes, but it makes me feel as if I'm in alignment with whatever the universe wants. And then whatever happens, I have to accept, okay, even though that doesn't look like the way I thought it would or the way I wanted it to, apparently that's what the universe wants. And ultimately, I even have to accept that with the election, that on some level.
Some pills are harder to swallow than others.
Exactly. This is one of the hardest ones ever.
So we're recording this, Karen, in National Cancer Awareness Month. And I know that you are also a breast cancer survivor. Can you say a bit about your journey in that respect and what got you through that and onto the other side of it? In addition to, of course, medical care and recovery, the physical stuff, but what do you think got you through in the, we'll call it in the non-physical stuff category, the emotional, psychological, spiritual, whatever it might be? How did you get through that and get to the other side?
Well, I had kind of an odd story about that. I had been working in the homicide unit for a few years, and I had started to feel very stressed about that work. And I actually went into my boss and said, I don't think I can do this much longer. I feel like this job is killing me. And he said, okay, I'll get you out of here. And he managed to get me into another unit that was less stressful. And I'd only been there for a couple of weeks when my son was in a car accident, which was a very scary thing. He was still young. He was heading to high school from the North Bay. And my husband texted me and said that our son had been in this accident. And so I immediately started praying. It was like, oh my God, Allah, Christ, Buddha, everybody, I just called them all in. And it was like, please just let him and his passenger be okay. I will accept anything. Just please let them be okay. And my son had been in, it was a pretty major accident. I mean, he totaled the car. He went across 4 lanes of freeway and on a wet day. And miraculously, he and the passenger walked away without a scratch on them. And about a week or so later, I happened to feel this sort of sharp pain in my breast. And I put my hand on my breast and I felt a lump. And I knew right away it was cancer because it didn't feel like anything I'd ever had before. And it was painful. And it was, even though people say cancer is not painful, at times it can be. And I knew that I had cancer. I just was like, it wasn't like I was being dramatic. It was like, oh, okay, yeah, this. And then I thought, the second thought I was like, I had was, oh, okay, I agreed to this, which I know is somewhat insane, but in my mind, I had made a deal and now this was going to happen to me because I totally knew that I could handle cancer, but I could not, I obviously could handle having a dead child, but I didn't want to have to handle that if I had to choose so anyway, this is what happened. And so I went through my whole process of treatment and everything, believing that I was dodging a worse bullet. So it kind of made that part of it easier for me, even though
you were actually dodging a lesser bullet, right?
A lesser bullet. Yes, right. A lesser bullet. And so I'll take the cancer for the block. And that was how I viewed it. And, it's people might just think I'm insane, which is fine, but it works for me. I think you have to kind of put a spin on things to make life work for you. So much of life is the stories we tell ourselves. So if the story you're telling yourself isn't working, you need another story, you just need another story. And so then, that journey was in itself just incredibly crazy because I found this lump in October. So actually, I'm coming on my 10-year anniversary now, which is amazing to me, of being through with the treatment or just being diagnosed, actually. And it was, I called for an appointment right away. I said, I found a lump. I think it's, and the breast cancer clinic was like, oh, it's October. It's Breast Cancer Awareness Month. So we're booked up until January. And I was like, well, yeah, but those are like screenings. Those are, I actually have something. And I know I was a little bit indignant, but finally I had my doctor call and they got me in right away. And I needed a biopsy. And I found out on Halloween, yes, it's triple negative cancer. And then, I just went down the journey of surgery and chemo and radiation. And I have a remarkable support system. I have women in the town I live in that we've been in the same book group for 20 years and they showed up for me and everybody was great. My husband was great. My sons were great. Everybody was great. So, yeah.
What strikes me about that story, Karen, that kind of you're telling yourself that this was the thing that you got because your son didn't die in the accident. And you know that that's a story that you told yourself. But it's funny that you told yourself a story. It almost is like it gave you control over the cancer, like,
Absolutely.
okay, I chose this, so here it is. It's something that can so often feel like you're just so out of control. It just happened to you through whatever biological mishaps happen. So it's interesting that sometimes the story that we need to tell ourselves is one that puts us back in our own driver's seat.
Yes, I agree. I think that, well, as I said, this is my thing now about the stories we tell ourselves and helping women write their stories, and how much of the story of our lives is how we view it. I can view my childhood as a tragedy. Oh, I had this bipolar mother. I was, committed to a mental institution before I was born in utero with my mother. I had just, years and years of her in and out of mental hospitals and having to be the parent of my mother. And it was all horrible. Or I can look back and say, I got to travel the world. I got to meet all sorts of interesting people and have experiences that most people never get to have in the life. And it made me adaptable, and it made me interested and curious. And, and both things can be true. Both things are true.
Sometimes two completely contradictory things can coexist, no?
Yes, absolutely.
Side by side. Well, as we begin to close here, the one other little piece of your story that's mentioned in your bio that I want to touch on too is that you have a family. You have Greg, whom you've been married to, and you have 2 sons, but you also have an adopted daughter whom you fought for to get. Can you say just a little bit about Kira and how she came into your world?
Yeah, Kira is 18 now, and she's just starting college. But I was for years obsessed with the idea of adopting a baby girl from China. I think that whole thing started by, I think I was watching Oprah or something, and she was showing an episode called, it was like an excerpt from a documentary called The Dying Room, and it was about the babies in China, the girl babies who were being abandoned. And from that moment on, I felt this really deep connection and idea that I was supposed to at some point adopt a girl from China. And I had gone to elementary school in Chinatown, so I guess I always felt sort of connected to that community in a way. Mm-hmm. And not that the Chinese is the same as American Chinese, but, I felt like some familiarity, some attachment to Chinese culture. Yeah. And so it wasn't until our boys were, I think they were about 7 and 10, when I started to really become more obsessed with it and bring it up to my husband as a possibility. And he very much felt like he was done raising children. He was 50. He was a little bit older than I was. He felt like he'd always planned to just have 2. And he wasn't really down. He wasn't excited about this whole thing. So we ended up in couples therapy. And at one point, he finally agreed to let me start the paperwork. But in reality, I was, expecting him to pull the rug out from under me at any moment and just say, I'm sorry, I just can't do this. So then down the road, I ended up writing the story of how we came to get her, because he finally agreed. And it was a very kind of a crazy thing. After we went through all of the procedures and had the social worker come and interview us and meet our children and filled out tons of paperwork and paid tons of money, we finally got a call from the facilitator from China, and he said, we have a baby for you. And my husband got on the other line. So we were both on the phone with Norman, and he was telling us all this information. And he said, the baby was found where she was found. She was in a cardboard box. She had a note from the birth mother. It had her date of birth and time on it, which is really important for Chinese astrology and blah, 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 and all this stuff. And he said, and your travel date is in a month. And so we both hung up, and then I met my husband in the hallway, and he had tears in his eyes. And my first thought was, oh, great, he's going to say, this is it. I just can't do it. No way. And he said, did you hear her birth date? And I said, yes, June 19th. And he said, that's my mom's birthday. And his mom had died just before my first child was born. And for him, that just like changed everything. And he's not like me. He's not woo woo, and he doesn't look for signs from the universe. But when he heard that her birth date was June 19th, and he also knew that I had been talking to his mom, who had died before our first child was born. And over the time of this 22 months we were trying to adopt Kira, I kept talking to his mom and saying, I know you always told me you loved your 3 boys, and you told me you were so happy to have a daughter because you always wanted a daughter. So please help me. I need a daughter. And so I felt really like his mom had helped me.
So you were talking to his mom after she'd passed. You were sort of mentally having those conversations.
Yes, I was asking her spirit to help me. And that was pretty, even Greg couldn't argue with that evidence that maybe she had helped me, given the birthday thing.
Well, it sounds like, you dismiss it as woo-woo, but I'm going to reframe it a little bit. This tenacity that you have for seeking the meaning in things, seeking the value, the importance, and the guidance of your instincts, of what you call your spiritual self. It sounds like that's been a really important quality in your life for getting through and around and over lots of things that you endure.
Yes, I think that's correct. And I don't want to give the impression that it's been like a steadfast spirituality where I never doubted that, it's not that at all. In fact, there are many times in my life when I've been very questioning about whether my beliefs were correct or
valid.
Even valid in any way. And so, that feeling comes and goes. But when the big things happen, for the most part, I have always felt somewhat guided and like I was supposed to do. Like I felt like I was supposed to become a cop. I was called to become a cop. I felt I was supposed to adopt Kira, all of these kind of things, that I was supposed to have my sons and things like that. So any big decision I have felt like has not started with me. I felt like it has come from somewhere else.
Mm. Well, Karen, thank you for sharing this bit of your life with us at the Morning Glory Project. And I invite people to find Good Cop, Bad Daughter. It's a riveting story and an inspiring one as well. And I hear that it's being entertained, or there's entertainment about it becoming a TV series. Is that still bubbling around? I know the wheels grind slowly.
Yeah, it's still bubbling. Hollywood's an interesting place, so you never know what's going to happen. But they have proposed a pilot, and so we'll see what happens.
Well, our fingers will be crossed for you.
Thank you.
Mostly not just because it's cool to get a TV story, but because yours is such an inspiring story as well. I hope that it finds its way to new audiences in whatever form that takes. Thanks for being such a generous person in your pages and in this conversation. Aww. And for being that kind of person that blooms in every kind of environment. Thanks so much for being here, Karen.
Thank you so much, Betsy. It was such a pleasure to talk with you.
When I listen to Karen's story, the extra blooms or the extra learnings that I have from it are rather simple in a way. Karen has a way of talking about her story in a very matter-of-fact way that sounds not so matter-of-fact to me, and I think that might be part of her character that makes her story so dynamic and interesting. Hers is just you put one foot in front of the other, you do what's right, you do what you have to do attitude. And there's something very refreshing about that. It's not a lot of analysis. She seems to have this true north sort of sense about her, that she just does what's right, even if it's different than what's going on around her. I find that really inspiring, and I'm going to call that my extra bloom for the day. Thanks for listening to the Morning Glory Project. If you've liked this episode or would like to listen to more, feel free to go to themorninggloryproject.com to find out how to subscribe in the format that works on your phone or computer. I'd like to give out special thanks to my producer, Jeremy Brisky, to Angela Washington, who's done some promotions for us, to Julie Valin, who's designed beautiful graphics for us, and to Eric Watley, who designed our theme music. Thanks for listening today, and if you're so inclined, go give us a like or a positive word in review. That helps other listeners find us. And for that, I thank you. Go out and bloom.